in Anne Munly's version of this inscription in the marble room, there is not only the history of the marble room, there is the history of your own inscriptions of Piranesi Interrupted, Boston Interrupted, and now Exhibition Interrupted. How does this exhibition relate to Piranesi Interrupted and the project you did in Boston, and what were those about?
Well, certainly that word interruption shows up in all of these projects, and it began with Piranesi Interrupted. Famous map by G.B. Piranesi from the 18th century, the Campus Martius map, and Piranesi had erased his contemporary Rome, 18th century Rome, in favor of sort of exhuming aspects of the ancient Rome, or what he imagined to be ancient Rome. Even though the Campus Martius in Roman times wasn't really a place of a lot of domesticity, the act of making the Campus Martius map by Piranesi and its fame really promoted a monumental city over domestic life in the city. And what I was trying to do was use inscription, so this was this idea of interrupting Piranesi's map by going back into the city and taking these excursions that I planned out in contemporary Rome, the Rome that I was living in, and make sketches and document the kind of everyday quotidian life. I was very influenced by Desserteau's work and writings at the time, and he wrote very beautifully about the walkers of the city write the city, that kind of thing.
Right.
And so then I took Piranesi's plates, I studied them in the Calcografia Nazionale, and then actually inserted or inscribed within them these aspects of domestic life. And I was basically tagging anything that I thought might be carrying that kind of DNA of domesticity and bringing it back into his plates, essentially.
Right.
So I did a whole series of sort of excursions, and it ended up being like 9 different plates that were part of my exhibition at the American Academy. But both texts had to be there. Actually, needed Piranesi as a kind of base to start from, and then to, in a sense, create a kind of conversation between these two conditions. In the Boston project, I returned from Italy and had been working on Boston before I went to Italy, but I looked at it now with new eyes, thinking about this idea of interruption. What I was fascinated with were the various histories of portions of maybe what we'd call central Boston right now, and was looking at, in particular, the North End and the West End. Those were 2 neighborhoods that were very close to one another, but one was preserved and one was torn down, and they were literally sort of cheek by jowl next to one another. There was, at the time, the Central Artery, or the Fitzgerald Expressway, became the Big Dig. But the Central Artery was still up, and it still, in a way, circumscribed the kind of edge between those 2 neighborhoods. In the first of the Boston Interrupted projects, I used photo etching, so a little bit different process. I took photographs and then also did photo etchings to kind of look at the West End in particular and its precarious condition next to this Central Artery. And also, it had a bullseye put on it when there was a development, the government center development. And then also with Victor Gruen, this whole new area called Charles River Park that was developed over the West End. And I found that loss of a very vibrant neighborhood, which is a history that we feel in many, many American cities, dating back to the 60s. Certainly Syracuse has a similar history. That was something that I wanted to capture. And I used this technique there called punctum, which was something that Warhol talks about, but basically a kissing between 2 etching plates, so that there's an instability of the image. So in that sense, it is a little bit palimpsest again. They kind of overlap. It's almost as if the image has a ghost that's somehow leaving or is only a bit present. And I used inks that had the connotation of architecture, those blue-black colors that we associate with blueprints and so forth.
Right.
And I introduced an elongated format, thinking that I could create these very, very long prints made up of a series of images that had this kind of unstable kind of aspect to them, to get across this sense of loss, really, on the West End. Where the next series in Boston Interrupted was a digital series. So it was printing, I still felt, but it was done through a computer and a printer. And this became super long. So I took that idea of narrative and length and made a series of prints that come out to be about 24 feet long and fold on one another, like those children's books where you can put the elephant head on the man's legs,
right.
That kind of thing.
Right.
With the idea that you could construct different narratives as you folded or unfolded these plates,
Right.
telling the story, the different stories between the removal of the West End and the keeping of the North End. So, yeah, there is a kind of palimpsest there as well, but done differently.
What's the relationship in terms of your own work between the screens that you're doing now, which are milled from digital files and drawings, and they're beautiful patterns, and they could be bent and they can be placed as screens, as framing devices in rooms, but they have many, many uses. But what is the relationship between those artifacts of artistic and design production and the previous work that you had been working on? Or do you see them connected to that work, or are they an extension of that work?
You know, I definitely see a relationship between flatbed processes, we'll say. But also now with the digital mill, that CNC mill is itself another kind of flatbed, clearly.
Right.
I mean, you put a piece of material on it, it's flat, and
Right.
you do something to it. But of course, it's also a digital flatbed process. So I see a relationship there, but there's an interesting transition too to this digital environment we're in.
I think what we're going to see, and I think your exhibition is a manifestation of this, is even greater fluidity between digital and analog, where they increasingly become more and more complementary one to the other than viewed as distinctly different ways of conceiving, designing, and even outputting and using. You're making a kind of vestibule inside a vestibule, which is a liminal zone between the digital and the physical, but also between the marble room as it used to be and what it is right now.
I love the fact that we can work in a material world, but our means into it these days are very often circumscribed, I think in a wonderful way, through the immaterial world of this kind of screen that we're on right now, which is incredibly powerful.